sovereignty and true internationalism. True internationalism must start at home, must start in each nation and in each country in order to have content. The problem in Europe is the left. The European left, the last 30 years, has gone on a very peculiar trip, a mental trip. I'm serious. After the defeats of the 1970s and the 1980s, with the rise of Thatcherism and neoliberalism and the decline of working class movements, the left lost much confidence. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc finished its confidence off. So the European left has come to believe that the European Union is inherently a progressive thing. The European Union is a progressive thing, apparently. It's a progressive thing because it transgresses the nation state, and therefore it must be good. And much of the logic and argument of the European left revolves around that. Anything that opposes the European Union is interpreted by much of the European left as being conservative and even reactionary. In this situation, and given what I showed you with the rise of German domination, it is not at all a surprise that as the tensions of Europe have increased, ordinary working people have gone to the right for answers. They've gone to the right for answers. The right has adopted much of the, many of the arguments of the left. You listen to the leadership of the right, of the extreme right often, it speaks like the left used to. It uses similar terminology. It refers to the same concerns and worries of the left. It talks about big business, big capital. It talks about loss of sovereignty. It talks about poverty. It talks about the institutions of Europe being oppressive. People understand that because they experience it. And so the extreme right gains influence, and the left has become cut off. The left of Europe, the European left, is a political tradition that emerged 200 years ago, at the time of the French Revolution, and always spoke for the poor, the impoverished, the bottom of society. It doesn't any longer. Today it doesn't. Most of the left in Europe does not. It has become cut off from the popular strata. It has become cut off from the working class. The problem then for adopting a policy like this is that it must start with the reorganization and a rethinking of the left. The left needs to rethink itself. It needs to find again its radical core. It needs to think about overthrowing the institutions of capitalism in Europe. It needs to think bravely and confidently about the future. It needs to believe in its own ideas. That we're not here to fix capitalism. We're here to put things in a different direction, in the interest of working people and in the interest of society. That's what needs to happen in Europe. This is the process in which we're engaged. The Latin American left has got something to teach Europe and the European left on this, and let's hope that this continues. Thank you very much.
Muito bem. A gente vai abrir para uma primeira rodada de perguntas. Antes disso, um recado aqui. As pessoas que têm o aparelho de tradução, por favor, na saída, devolver o aparelho assim que deixar o auditório. Eu esqueci de fazer isso na minha fala inicial. Eu queria agradecer e deixar nosso reconhecimento para todos os voluntários. São 40 alunos voluntários que estão ajudando nesse evento. Aqui tem um fotógrafo aqui, então eu queria um aplauso para o fotógrafo. Em nome dele, a gente agradece todo mundo. Obrigado. Perguntas? Pedro Paulo, Luiz Fernando, aqui. Alguma menina? Marisa começa aqui. Aqui tem 4 mil. Depois o Pedro Paulo, Luiz Fernando. Aqui tem uma. Peço atenção de todos, a pergunta da Marisa. Se puder levantar.
Levantar? Não. Marisa, Universidade Federal de Uberlândia. Antes de tudo, Costas, é um prazer bem grande te ter aqui. Então, agradecer. Então, agradecer pela disponibilidade, né, por ter vindo trazer essa discussão para a gente. O que eu queria te perguntar é o seguinte: bom, você vem há muito tempo já fazendo essa defesa em favor da saída, né, enfim, na verdade, do fim, né, da zona do euro, enfim, trazendo todos esses elementos que justificam a sua argumentação, e para os que acompanharam, né, o caso grego, criou-se uma expectativa muito grande de que esse seria o momento, né, de que agora, finalmente, a ruptura se daria. Bom, não se deu, você mencionou alguns elementos de por que é que isso não aconteceu, e eu te pergunto se você entende que isso foi assim, uma profunda perda de oportunidade, né, de se concretizar esse movimento de saída da zona do euro, se, portanto, houve uma perda de um momento histórico importante, ou se há, num horizonte próximo, a possibilidade de que, de novo, enfim, haja um forte apoio popular e a constituição de um grupo à frente desse movimento de saída ali na Grécia. Obrigada.
O palestrante Costas me pediu para fazer um bloco de 4 perguntas e depois a gente responde e aí volta. A gente tem tempo para um debate longo. Tem aqui escrito o Arnaldo, o Pedro Paulo e o Luiz Fernando nesse primeiro bloco. Cadê o Arnaldo? Depois, ali o segundo bloco.
Okay. First of all, Carlos status Tosep, Kai Carlos Sori, Sates Tim Campinas, Elipsona Chetemia, Efcharis Tidamoni. Second of all, my question. It is no doubt that capitalism as economic system is in a meltdown. It is obvious, it's something is common sense, but you said we are not here to fix it or analyze it as a system, but we must think about the human being that belongs to them. Analyzing of that, we know Greece is a sovereign nation who belongs to one continent, and as it is, it's subordinated by a core, which in the case remaining to Germany. But analyzing the other numbers and analyzing the other systems of the world system as it's well, becomes as a little question that if there's a way out to Greece or a Grexit in the first, the dependency of Greece will not pass to another country. Well, I mean, with the rise of China in the Greek economics in some sectors and some privatizations, for example, the Piria port in Athens or the other systems, or the United States as the hegemony itself. Well, the question is, the Brexit and the renationalization of Greece will not at all become an intermediate place in the world system, changing only the hegemon, which is subordinated, or the Greek sovereignty would be as Greece posed in a core in this world system. Thank you very much. Hephaestus.
Pedro Paulo.
Costas, muito obrigado por vir a Campinas. Meu nome é Pedro Paulo, sou professor aqui da Unicamp. Queria fazer também a pergunta que a Marisa fez, mas ela já fez. Eu tenho uma outra questão relacionada ao diagnóstico da crise europeia. Eu gostaria que você falasse um pouco da controvérsia que ocorreu no Institute for New Economic Thinking entre você, o professor Heiner Fleisbeck, de um lado, e de outro, o professor Sevas Storm, porque é muito relevante para a gente, porque também há um grande debate no Brasil a respeito dos motivos da crise, e há um conjunto de economistas que enfatizam muito a questão dos diferenciais salariais e do impacto dos salários como elemento de custo, de competitividade das empresas industriais, e há outros economistas em que eu, digamos, estou incluído, que tem uma visão que enfatiza mais tanto os diferenciais de renda, de crescimento da renda entre diferentes países e os diferenciais de competitividade de ordem tecnológica entre países que têm estruturas muito diferentes. E, certamente, esse é o principal elemento da controvérsia que ocorreu entre você e o professor Sevas Storm. Gostaria que você fizesse um balanço disso, por favor.
Ok. Alô. Eu, Luiz Fernando de Paula, sou professor de Economia da Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. Eu vou fazer uma colocação a respeito da crise do euro e outras a respeito da crise grega, especificamente. Com relação à crise do euro, eu gostaria de ouvi-lo. A impressão que eu tenho é que, particularmente, comparativamente, a resposta em termos de políticas anticíclicas dos Estados Unidos em relação à Europa é a ausência de instrumentos anticíclicos na zona do euro para enfrentar a crise, né? Então, a impressão que eu tenho é que a experiência do euro ele não foi preparada para enfrentar a crise, né? Você não tinha, por exemplo, o Banco Central Europeu como emprestador de última instância. Você tem um sistema de governança extremamente complexo e lento, né? Então, eu gostaria de ouvir um pouco sobre isso. Com relação à Grécia, eu vou colocar 3 questões. A primeira gostaria de ouvi-lo o porquê, a sua avaliação, do porquê da imposição de políticas de austeridades à Grécia, né, pelas lideranças europeias. É um problema de moral hazard, é um problema de políticas puramente de direita, né? Então, eu gostaria de ouvir um pouco qual é a sua avaliação desse processo. Uma outra questão que eu gostaria de ouvir é com relação à sua proposta, né, de voltar para uma moeda doméstica grega, né? Particularmente, eu estive no ano passado num workshop em Berlim e vi a apresentação de uma cientista política que ela fez um trabalho de survey, agora não me lembro os números exatamente, mas mostrou que a maioria dos gregos era contra o programa de austeridade, mas a maioria dos gregos tinham medo de fazer a conversão da moeda para a moeda doméstica, né? Então, eu pergunto a você, quer dizer, particularmente a questão do medo, né, da conversão, os custos da conversão em termos de perda de PIB, como é que você avalia? Foi feita uma mensuração disso? Foi colocado isso, essa questão foi colocada como uma coisa, na sua avaliação, como algo exagerado, etc, etc. E, por último, uma pergunta seguinte: a Espanha fez um ajuste ortodoxo com redução de salário, forte redução de salário, e tem conseguido, mais recentemente, um crescimento pelo lado das exportações. como é que você avalia esse tipo de caminho para no caso da Grécia? Obrigado.
Okay, I'll take him. Let me take the technical points first, and then go to the broader questions. When the Eurozone crisis happened in 2010, any rational economist and any rational human being would have said that adjustment must take place jointly. In other words, the deficit countries and the surplus countries must adjust if you want to follow the logic of the Eurozone. The adjustment was imposed completely on the deficit countries. That's not accidental. It's not accidental. It actually tells you what the Eurozone is. The main deficit country, Germany, which was also the main lender, was not subjected to any adjustment at all that I can see. And the policies that were applied were imposed on the borrowers because they were thought to be the problem countries. Those policies were standard IMF balance of payment crisis policies. In other words, austerity, privatization, liberalization, and so on. There's nothing new there. It's exactly what the IMF has applied in many other places, but it's applied in Europe. So austerity was applied in Greece ostensibly because of that. Now why? Why did they choose this path? Because it was in the interest of German exporting capital. German exporting capital would not tolerate anything else. There was nothing wrong with the monetary union as far as German exporters are concerned. The monetary union is a perfect system. What's wrong with it? Through it, you make huge surpluses. And that has been the reality in Germany solidly. Solidly. There is a unshakable political opinion in Germany in this respect, and an unshakable pressure on the part of German big business to keep things this way. Actually, austerity right now has become institutionalized in the European Union because of German pressure. So, in the case of Greece, it was nonsense. We know. It created a disaster, but from the perspective of those who make policy, it wasn't nonsense, it was logical. So it happened. Now, what was the problem with the European Monetary Union, the counter-cyclical policies, and why were not better policies applied? There's been a massive debate on this in Europe and elsewhere. And it has to do with the architecture of the monetary union, which I mentioned quickly in my talk. It is true that the architecture of the monetary union was problematic in the first instance. This was pointed out by Marty Feldstein, conservative American economist, long before the European Monetary Union became a reality. All it took was a reasonable economist to look at it and realize this would not work because it has no mechanism for fiscal adjustment. It doesn't have a central bank that can work as a lender of last resort for states and so on. We know all that. Why not? Why did it not have these? That's the real question. And I'll tell you why not. Because there is no European people. There is no European nation. There is no European country. It doesn't exist. There is no European banking system. There are 27 countries in the European Union, and they will remain so. There are 19 countries in the monetary union, and they will remain so. It's a figment of the imagination of economists and others that you could create a monetary union, and gradually, before the people realize it, you will have created political union. This is nonsense. You cannot do that. So these policies that would have been possible in the United States and were possible in the United States were not possible in Europe because these are independent states. What does it mean to have fiscal transfers? To have fiscal transfers, what you've got to do is accept that German taxpayers will carry the cost of decisions by the Greek state. There is no basis for that. There is no basis in shared ideology, no basis in shared identity, no basis in law in Europe. It couldn't be, and it will never be, in my judgment. So the architecture was deficient because the system makes it so. But I repeat, it wasn't the architecture that caused the crisis. Architecture can be wrong. You still don't end up with a crisis. The wrong architecture was crucial in responding perhaps to the crisis, not effectively. The crisis was not caused by that. It was caused fundamentally by what was happening in Germany, by capital-labor relations in Germany. This is where one has to start. In other words, even with the wrong architecture, the European Monetary Union could work if Germany did not look after its interests in such a rigid way, if it was prepared to share some of the costs. But as I say, such a thing will not happen. Now, which takes me to the other technical point about the debate in INET and so on. There are basically three lines of argument about the Eurozone crisis, what has caused the crisis. One line of argument looks at competitiveness, and it has two currents within it. The mainstream current is the current of the European Union. This is what Mr. Schäuble in Germany argues. This is what the European Union argues. And it says the crisis occurred because the competitiveness of the peripheral countries is weak. Why is competitiveness weak according to this interpretation? Because these countries have got inefficient institutions. Their workers do not work very hard. They are lazy southerners. They take big holidays. They like spending money. Their states are inefficient. And therefore, says this argument, to get out of the crisis, we need to fix these countries by fixing their institutions. This is the official line of the European Union, and therefore you have austerity, liberalization, privatization, and so on. The competitiveness argument contains also the approach I gave you. That's a very, very different take. That says, yes, competitiveness is very important in a monetary union, but the problem here is capital-labor relations in Germany, in the core country. It's got nothing to do with efficiency and inefficiency of the, or little to do with efficiency and inefficiency of the peripheral countries. Now, we also have a third approach. This approach has come from much of the left. Confronted with the argument by Schäuble and the rest of the European Union that stressed competitiveness, many on the left thought we must find an argument that doesn't depend on competitiveness. Competitiveness is a bad word. It's a capitalist word. Some people have argued that it's a capitalist term. And so we must develop an argument that leaves competitiveness out of the equation and concentrates on something else. What's something else? Obviously, banks. Banks are the obvious candidate. So the counter-argument was the real problem was banks and capital flows. Banks from the core lent to the periphery took the money, engaged in spending, the spending brought in imports, and then the periphery ended up in crisis. This is putting the cart before the horse. It's bad economics. Bad economics and bad analytics. There was a credit bubble in the South, of course, but it was created by the banks of the South. The real problem, I repeat, in any monetary union is the way competitiveness unfolds, which brings me to the debate with Storm. I'm not entirely certain what Servaas Storm has argued, to be honest, and I don't think he knows himself either. I mean, the argument wasn't clear to me. But it seemed to be arguing that there was some kind of productivity miracle in Germany. Because obviously, if you're going to argue that Germany has been so successful, then it must have done well in terms of productivity. productivity growth in German industry is a bit better than what I showed you there. This was aggregate productivity. But there's been no miracle. There is no miracle of productivity in Germany. It's completely fictitious. German exporters have triumphed not because of productivity gains, but because of keeping wages down, suppressing wages. This is a very important argument to develop, and it brings me to the point you're making about Brazil. I don't really want to intervene in that debate because I don't know that much about it, but I want to tell you one thing on it. Competitiveness among nations is not the same thing as competitiveness between businesses and competitiveness between enterprises. These are very different concepts. Competitiveness between enterprises depends on a host of factors that include management practices, labor skills, technologies, and so on. A whole list of factors, and wages there could be at the bottom. Could be the last thing that matters. If you talk to corporate management, they'll tell you often wages are the